Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome from snowy Boston, where we just dug out from under more than about a foot of snow. Although school was canceled here today and some teachers even lost their power, professional learning goes on undeterred, I'm happy to say. We're so pleased to have all of you join us, and we hope you'll be active participants today, making comments, sharing resources, and posing questions in our chat box. My name's Deborah Cunningham, and I'll be facilitating our webinar, which is the third of 3 webinars in Primary Sources series on racial injustice and the African American experience. Today's topic follows from the groundwork that we laid in our prior 2 webinars on the social legacies of slavery and on the injustice system, which looked at legal means of discrimination. Today, we're going to be discussing the Black Lives Matter movement, where it came from, and what it is working to achieve. I am delighted to introduce not 1, but 2 guest speakers today who bring complementary areas of expertise. Our first speaker is going to be John Stauffer. John is the Sumner and Marshall Cates Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. At Harvard, he teaches courses on American protest movements, the Civil War, and slavery and abolitionism, among other topics. Some of his many books include Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, a biography of the song that marches on, The State of Jones, and most recently, Picturing Frederick Douglass, an illustrated biography of the 19th century's most photographed American. After John speaks, we'll be hearing from our second guest, Lauryn Mascareñez, who joins us from the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. At SPLC, Lauryn works for the Teaching Tolerance Project, which, in case you haven't encountered it in the past, Teaching Tolerance provides free resources, free and really superb resources, to teachers to support them in educating students to be agents of change for social justice, as well as active participants in a diverse and inclusive democracy. At Primary Source, we think of Teaching Tolerance's mission as closely allied with our own, and we're so pleased to be collaborating with them for the first time. Lauryn is a seasoned educator with a decade of experience as an elementary classroom teacher, a literacy instructional coach, and culturally responsive trainer. She has a BA in American Studies and a master's in culturally responsive teaching, both of them from the University of Colorado. Lauryn is passionate about educating teachers on engagement strategies and is particularly interested in closing the opportunity gap for young males of color. She's currently working on her doctorate in leadership in organizational systems from Vanderbilt. After Lauryn presents, we'll have ample time for Q&A with both of our guests, so please post your questions as we go, and we'll address them in the final segment of the webinar, if not before. Now I'm going to turn it over to John Stauffer, who will begin by setting the historical context for the Black Lives Matter movement. So John, go ahead and activate your microphone by clicking Talk, and welcome to you.
Thank you, Deb. Can everyone hear me? I hope so.
Yes.
Okay. Deb says that I'm comparatively clear. So as she pointed out, I'd like to provide a background or contextualize Black Lives Matters in the history of American protest movements more generally. It's in its 5th year, Black Lives Matter is, and it's arguably the most visible protest movement in the United States right now, which is actually significant because most successful protest movements have a genesis and a beginnings that require often many years before it becomes household name and visible in the way the Black Lives Matters is imminently visible.
John,
Everyone
speak
is
up
familiar
just
with
a tad. Try to speak
Okay.
just a bit louder.
It's a grassroots movement. It organizes community by community, neighborhood in a sense by neighborhood, but especially city by city. It was, as you know, inspired by the killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman. It is a global network. It was created or initially started by 3 radical black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patricia Cullors, and Opal Tometi. It's now a member-led global network of over 40 chapters in which members organize and build local networks to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by state and by other vigilantes. So it begins as a grassroots movement, but like other, in a sense, successful protest movement, has a national and even a global reach. It is intimately, I think, connected to and Black Lives Matter founders and activists identify themselves with 2 recent and also significant protest movements, and that are Black Panthers and Black Power, which became immensely prominent in the 1960s. The Black Panther Party was founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in October of 1966, and Black Panthers, a signature aspect of their movement was self-determinism, was to police their own communities, protecting other African Americans, and ensuring that they had equal rights and an equal voice. And it was the Black Panther Party was itself very closely connected to Black Power, and Black Power movement was identified as dating from June of 1966, in which Stokely Carmichael, then the chair of SNCC, in a speech declared that we've been saying freedom for 6 years. This was in Greenwood, Mississippi, as part of a support for James Meredith, who was shot during his walk against fear from Memphis to Jackson. And Stokely said, then what we are going to start saying now is Black Power. And for both Black Power advocates and activists and for Black Panther activists, they espoused an expansive sense of hopefulness and radical democracy, and that is also what Black Lives Matter activists are also espousing. The goal of all 3 movements was to change laws, policies, hearts, and minds. There were some differences. Black Power and Black Panther movements sought to, they focused actually less on criminal justice and more on ending segregation, gaining voting rights, opening up employments, changing laws, policies, hearts, and minds. Black Lives Matter, one of their primary foci is on criminal justice, and that stems from the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, other racial equality acts, which then prompts the rise of mass incarceration, which becomes a way of overturning the National Equal Rights Acts. What Black Lives Matter advocates are doing to confront police violence today and mass incarceration today is similar to what Black Power advocates and Black Panthers did in the 60s, particularly the use of what scholars have called street theater, using the streets as a way to raise consciousness, raise awareness, and also the use of cameras. Black Power activists, Black Panther activists, and Black Lives Matter activists all recognize the degree to which the camera is understood as a truth-telling medium. And by using the camera to document the atrocities and also the successes of their movements, sends a message that becomes immensely inspiring for others who then become converts to the cause. Both Black Power and Black Panthers and Black Lives Matters, women in all three movements, women were also central to the movement. Let me show you some images that capture visually the significance of them. Here's the Black Power, Black Lives Matter fists, and you see the influence of the Black arts movement on Black Power and Black Lives Matter. The Black arts movement was, in a sense, the visual and aesthetic counterpart to Black Panthers and the Black Power in the 60s. It coincided during the exact same period. So on the top left, you have a symbol of Black Power with the closed fist. Black Lives Matters transforms it into a kind of woodcut, a classic, kind of almost a German expressionist woodcut, and that reflects an aesthetic within the Black arts movement. The Black Panther Party, this is the logo of the Black Panther Party, which is stark kind of black and white, this Black Panther springing toward the viewer as if to force the viewer into confronting the racial injustice with a white background. And here's the Black Panther Party poster showing different leaders within the Black Panther and the use of guns as a form of protection, as a form of self-defense, was very common among Black Power activists, Black Panther activists, and it's also used in Black Lives Matters, unlike the Martin Luther King's organization that publicly advocated nonviolence. Black Panther, Black Power is not publicly stating that they are not using guns. And what's significant about King's movement is that they recognize that nonviolent direct action, the symbolism of nonviolence was what was particularly important, and that African Americans were a minority, and so to at a large scale mass effort to endorse the use of carrying weapons or guns or violence was, because they were a minority in America, was counterproductive. At the same time, many, if not most, of the leadership within King's movement often carried guns for their own protection. But the image and the symbolism that was spread was one of nonviolence, in part as a form of protection. Here's the Black Power salute, one of the most iconic images of Black Power from the 1968 Olympics, in which Americans Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists with black gloves on the podium. And it is a kind of signature image in the way that Black Lives Matter signs that are seen on everything from church doors to private lawns to numerous public establishments, has also become a kind of signature sign. Now, a deeper connection or deeper history of Black Lives Matter and Black Panthers and Black Power dates back to the abolition movement. And I should say that one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullors, has openly acknowledged her debt and the intimate connections with Black Panther and Black Panthers and Black Power. In fact, there's a very good YouTube video of her describing the intimate connections between Black Panthers and Black Power. But there's also, it can date back to the 1850s in particular, at a time in which, following with an increasing sectional crisis over slavery, and especially beginning in 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, which virtually legitimates the kidnapping of free blacks in the North and requires all Northerners to participate in the roundup of suspected fugitives, to be deputized, so to speak, and if one refused, they were automatically fined, and it was fined $1,000, which was in a sense $75,000 in today's dollars, and if one was caught aiding and abetting a suspected fugitive, it was an automatic prison term. And the law, when I say it virtually legitimates the kidnapping of free blacks, it ignores due process. It goes before a federal commissioner who gets paid twice as much to send the suspect back into slavery as to then if he announces that the suspect was free. One of the effects is that it radicalizes white Northerners, and it unites them with African Americans, with Black Northerners as never before, and it prompts Black communities throughout the North to form these vigilante associations, and for these vigilante associations to circulate far more than they had. And essentially the vigilante associations, the best way to summarize them is they're the direct precursor of the Black Panther Party, in which African Americans policed the streets, often armed, as a way to protect blacks from potential slave catchers or those who might try to send a black into slavery. And they often worked with white radicals and in their organizational efforts. And they were very vocal about it. And I'm showing right now an advertisement from William Cooper Nell, who was a Boston radical abolitionist, a member of the Boston Vigilante Association. He was also the first black historian in the United States, and he wrote a book on what it was called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which is essentially a book on the crucial role of blacks in American military from the Revolution and through the 1850s. And one of his main arguments was that for blacks to serve in the military was a symbol of their equal citizenship, which was under immense debate at the time. And in fact, this advertisement at the top, you can see the question, are colored men citizens? And his book sought to answer that question once and for all. Yes, blacks are citizens, as they are patriots of the idea of democracy and of equal rights and of equal protection under the law. And that is also an argument in this sense of self-determinism, which was central to William Cooper Nell and the vigilante associations in policing their own communities and protecting each other, was also central to Black Power, Black Panthers, and now the Black Lives Matters movement. Another example, again connecting from 1850s to the 1960s and today, is the example of it's a broadside of, for Anthony Burns, one of the most famous fugitive cases, also in Boston in 1854, in which it declares, it sends a message. This is an age before television age. It's the broadside, a poster, was one of the most common ways to mobilize and rally a large public, in the same way that Facebook and Twitter are used as a way to mobilize people today. They used posters, they used cameras in the same way that Black Lives Matter uses Twitter and Facebook. In the new technology of their day, you could say that activists, black and white activists in the abolitionists and in Black Power and in Black Panthers all use the new technologies of their days in the same way that Black Lives Matter does today. So this poster is just broadcasting the degree to which a man has been kidnapped. There will be a public meeting. This public meeting results in an attempt to liberate or free Anthony Burns, in which hundreds of blacks and whites surround the courthouse, and there's an effort to they enter the courthouse and try to liberate Anthony Burns. One guard is killed. He is similar to today and similar to Black Panther, that whites are deputized to help, essentially to help ensure and to help protect white supremacy. And this broadside refers to this collage that also gets circulated of Anthony Burns describing, it describes the cycle. He starts as a slave who reaches, comes to Boston, he's kidnapped. He's eventually remanded back into slavery, but black and white abolitionists immediately raise money, and they contact his master and pay what his master requires, and they free Burns by paying the master, and they send him to Oberlin College, and he becomes an African-American minister. And similar to the way in which Black Lives Matter has mobilized and rallied entire communities that have led to numerous marches and protest parades, on the day that federal troops are brought in to ensure that Anthony Burns is sent back into slavery, roughly a quarter of the population of Boston marches in protest against this remanding of Anthony Burns into slavery, which resonates or connects to the Women's March in the immediate wake of Trump's election. And here are some activists in the wake of Anthony Burns being sent back into slavery. And this is a Boston Vigilante Committee broadside where they call on citizens to keep as it says in the bottom, a sharp lookout for kidnappers, have a top eye open, to protect citizens of the community, meaning African Americans. These are all as a part of the effort to ensure, to protect African Americans and the activism for achieving self-determinism. In one sense, you could say that the Black Lives Matters and the Black Power and the Black Panther movement dates back to this pamphlet right here by David Walker. It's called An Appeal in 4 Acts, or it's better known as David Walker's Appeal. It's published in 1829 and 2 other editions in 1830 and 1831. And the reason I mention it is that a central argument for Black Lives Matters and for Black Panthers and Black Power is that it begins as a grassroots movement. It emphasizes the idea of self-determinism and of all these members, blacks in the community, of using their voice, of demanding equal rights under the law. And in a sense, it is an advocacy for what several scholars have called black nationalism. And David Walker's appeal is often called or seen as the Bible or the origins of black nationalism, in which black nationalism means something very different from what a lot of people assume it means. For a lot of Americans in particular, black nationalism is based on the idea of separatism, that blacks unite only amongst themselves and not amongst other allies, particularly white allies, and that's simply not true. The keynote of Walker's appeal is that their emphasis on the sense of pride and dignity and demanding respect among African Americans, and thus achieving equal rights, equality before the law, in addition to freedom. And as Walker makes clear in his articles, in which it's an appeal to the slaves of the world, particularly in the colored, but in particular those of the United States, he's not excluding white abolitionists and activists. He's embracing them if they accept and embrace blacks on blacks' own terms, meaning if whites accept blacks based on blacks' own sense of pride and dignity and respect, they will be befriended, they will be part of this movement. And what Walker is very sensitive to is this notion of what's now called white paternalism, meaning that the recognition that many whites will work with blacks to achieve freedom or equality if blacks accept the mores and the values of white society. And for Walker, blacks need to be treated and accepted on their own terms and demanding that. And that's a central theme of the Black Power movement and Black Panther movement and the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of this emphasis on respect and dignity and pride and their own self-determinism. As scholars, particularly Peniel Joseph, who's now at University of Texas, Austin. He had been at Tufts University. He's really one of the founders of what's now known as the Black Power studies in his books. I'll end just with a few examples of Frederick Douglass, the kind of early originator of Black Lives Matter and of Black Power and Black Panther, and particularly in his use in photography. So my most recent book is on Douglass as the most photographed American in the United States, which is significant because, or most photographed American in the 19th century. It's significant because it means that there are more separate photographs of Douglass than of any other 19th century American, more so than of Lincoln, than of Grant, than of Custer, than of Whitman, than of any other figure you want to name. Now, had Lincoln lived, there almost certainly would have been more separate photographs of Lincoln. But what this means is that Douglass is a public face of the United States, and he's everywhere recognized as a major leader and intellectual and a spokesperson, not just for African Americans, but for Americans. He's a public face of America, demanding equality and freedom at a time in which many white Americans want to define America and do define America as a white man's nation. And that vision of whether or not the United States is a multiracial, egalitarian nation or a white man's nation, in my view, is still with us. Douglass recognized early on that photography could be a powerful weapon in the cause of racial justice, of ending slavery and racism, and he wrote more extensively on photography and why he recognized its power than any other American in the 19th century. And from the very year that he became a public spokesperson on behalf of anti-slavery and anti-racism is when he began having himself photographed as a way to document his equal status as a citizen. And this particular photograph is an early image that is on the left is the photograph, and the way photographs get disseminated at this time is when a engraving is cut from a photograph that then is mass-produced in books or in newspapers. In this case, the engraving cut from the photograph on the left is laterally inverted, and it appears in one of Douglas's books that raises money for his newspaper. This becomes, in 1852, Douglas experiments with different looks or poses, and this becomes his signature pose that he used to present himself to the public from early 1850s through the end of the Civil War. And one female convert to the cause of abolitionism saw this particular photograph and declared Douglas, or called Douglas, majestic in his wrath. And I think it wonderfully captures the look and what Douglas sought. In the way in which he is looking directly at the viewer, essentially at a time in which photographic manuals taught photographers to pose men to look above or beyond the camera lens, what they call the visionary gaze. And Douglas decides he wants to confront viewers and stare them down. He always dressed immaculately as though he should be allowed in and would be comfortable in the White House or the most lavish parlor or home in the United States. He, during the Civil War, becomes the first African American to meet with and advise a U.S. president, when he meets with and advises Lincoln 3 times. And they publicly declare themselves friends at a time in which friendship meant equality. In the largest sense, this pose by Douglas, this majestically wrathful pose, is a way of him declaring that he demands to be treated as a social equal in a democracy. In his look, in his majestically wrathful look, he can outdress even the most well-dressed democratic citizen. He can out-orate the greatest order, and in fact he could. He could command a higher speaking fee than any other American, and he could outwrite most democratic Americans, which he could. He was an immensely best-selling author. In a sense, he is sending a message that he can out-citizen and does out-citizen white citizens at a time in which most whites try to argue that blacks should not have equal citizenship.
I just want to interject for 1 second in the interest of time to let you know you have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm almost done. This is the most widely circulated image of Douglas in the 19th century because it appears as the frontispiece for My Bondage and My Freedom. So this would be the analog of the Black Lives Matters placard, which is such a signature image, or the 1968 John Carlos and Tommy Smith photo, the signature image of Black Power, in which here Douglas is clenching his fist as a way of insisting upon his equal citizenship, equal participation. He was inspired by, in part, by Lincoln's election, and he recognized, as this is a Matthew Brady photograph on the left that becomes an engraving cut from it and appears on the cover of Harper's Weekly, and Matthew Brady declares or says that his photograph of Lincoln, or according to Lincoln himself, the Brady photograph elected Lincoln, because it coincided with the time, for the first time, with the rise of visual culture in which Americans wanted to be able to visualize their political candidate. Douglason captured it more succinctly by saying that the portrait elects the president, recognizing the power of photography. Also recognizing the degree to which a photograph highlights the equal basis of all individuals. And 95% of photographs were portraits, and it reveals these individuals in the same equal degree of detail and accuracy, and thus of beauty. Here's Douglas himself on the cover of Harper's Weekly a few years later. And I'll end just by saying that this debate, what I've revealed is that, in a sense, we're still fighting the same fight that Douglas was, whether it's with Black Power, Black Lives Matter, or the Neo-Confederacy, the degree to which Neo-Confederates are still seeking this vision of a white man's democracy. Dylan Roof is explicitly posing with the Confederate flag, seeking to erase the idea of equal citizenship for blacks. Here's a Mississippi state flag with the Confederate emblem still on it, which also circulates widely. And as everyone knows, the Charlottesville, Virginia riot really was a new battle within the Civil War, which at the time everyone recognized was over the status of blacks in American society, which is a central question that we continue to face today. Here's the white supremacists waving the Confederate flag at the Charlottesville riot, and a car killing one person drives into a crowd of activists. And I'll end with that.
John, thanks so much for giving us the background and deep roots of the movement and some of the parallels to past major movements in the history of African Americans in the U.S. Now we're going to turn it over to Lauryn Mascareñez, who joins us from Teaching Tolerance at the Southern Poverty Law Center, to address this fundamental question of how do you bring Black Lives Matter into the classroom? How do you teach a movement that's fairly new and about which kids have a lot of questions? So Lauryn, thanks for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone here who is joining us today. Like Deborah said, I'm going to be talking about bringing Black Lives Matter into your school and into your classroom. So just to start off I want to talk a little bit about why teaching Black Lives Matter matters. So this is a quote that came out of an article that we have that shares the same title from our magazine that we have at Teaching Tolerance, but I want to draw your attention to that bold part at the bottom that says we have a civic responsibility to be educated about Black Lives Matter, and as we learn, we must teach. As teachers, we really function as caretakers, truth seekers, advocates of justice, and it's not only civic responsibility, but I would say like a moral responsibility to be educated about what's happening in our country. Black Lives Matter is a large movement, and it is a continuation of the civil rights movement that's been happening in our country for quite some time. So as we become educated ourselves about what Black Lives Matter is and what it is not, we also need to be able to teach our students about what that means. So thinking about why it matters, think about hindsight being 20/20. In this sense, when the civil rights movement was happening, it was denounced. It was something that, was not seen positively in the media, and it was very unpopular at its time. But with distance, it's celebrated, and we look upon the figures at the time who were denounced, and now we see them as very positive heroes. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, kind of get this hero status within our culture that they did not celebrate and that they did not have at the time. So I think it's important to remember that hindsight is 20/20, so the way people are reacting to Black Lives Matter now is going to be seen very different in the context of history. So this is history repeating itself. We're seeing a continuation of the civil rights movement happening, but we're seeing it very differently because we're in the process of engaging with it currently. So that second part is something that is commonly brought up in terms of Black Lives Matter in the sense that all lives matter. So this is a direct retaliation to the statement Black Lives Matter. And the best kind of analogy that I heard for all lives matter that I would like to share with you just to kind of think about is if a person goes to the doctor and they say, my arm is broken. And the doctor says, well, all your bones matter. And the patient says, sure, but can we focus on the broken one right now? That's something that's very similar to what I see is happening with Black Lives Matter, in that we are, Black Lives Matter is saying this needs help. Of course all lives matter. We never said that they didn't. But we really want to talk about how Black Lives Matter really needs to be said, because systemically in what's happening in our country, it is very clear that oftentimes they do not. So in saying so, thinking about how we teach Black Lives Matter and we bring the movement into our classroom. When we bring it into our classroom, we really open the doors for larger conversations to happen about truth, about justice, about activism, healing, reconciliation. These are the conversations that we need to happen. And in this country, until we have kind of a reckoning about who we are and what our national identity is, we will continue to see issues of oppression and systemic racism in our society until we really have those open and larger conversations. And that needs to start with schools, and that needs to start with students, and that needs to start with educators. It needs to happen everywhere. And this is really a way to also bring in conversations about other movements that are happening in our country. So when we're talking about activism, what's happening today, the school walkout is happening today for #NeverAgain. We're talking about gun violence in our schools. This can be for the Me Too movement, where women are standing up against sexual harassment, women and men. We're talking about the LGBT rights struggle, or Standing Rock, where we saw a huge amount of activism come out, historical union movements, etc. This is how you tie in why teaching Black Lives Matter, because these huge conversations that are happening in our country and that are happening right now in our society, kids are not immune to them. They hear them just like we do, and they're part of them. And just like we all come to work and we need to talk to people about what happened, we need to talk to our spouses or our friends or siblings about what's happening, our students need that outlet too, and they don't always have it. And so being able to have these larger conversations about justice, about how do we reconcile our history, are very important. So that is a little bit of background about why teaching Black Lives Matter really matters. I also want to draw your attention to another article that we had. It's called Don't Say Nothing. And a few points about Don't Say Nothing. So in thinking about our comforts, really need to come second to those of children. And it is uncomfortable sometimes to have racial conversations. And it is sometimes difficult. The vast majority of teachers are middle-aged white women, and we now know that the demographics of our students in the United States are students of color. And so it may be an uncomfortable conversation sometimes. It has to happen, but our comforts need to come second to those of the children. I'm not necessarily comfortable teaching math, but I do it anyways because I need to make sure that my students are receiving the content that I need to deliver. The second part of Don't Say Nothing is the appreciation and the silence. So thinking about when we as a society appreciate what Black people have done for, kind of this appreciation of Black culture, but we're silent about the oppression that has happened to them. And what does that silence sound like to children? So when we say, we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King, or we celebrate rap or Black culture or fashion or Beyonce or whatever that looks like, but we are categorically silent about the oppression that has happened and also the history of what has done. So that third point that says, what have they done for this country versus what has been done to them? So thinking about how we present, Black History Month or Black figures throughout our curriculum. We talk about what they have contributed to this country, but have we really had very honest conversation about what has happened to them in this country? Our students are listening. So teaching as an act of resistance and teaching as an act of healing are not mutually exclusive. We can do both. We have that civic responsibility that I talked about earlier, but education is a form of resistance, and we can heal from it, and we can heal from those wounds. A huge project that we've been working on recently at Teaching Tolerance is called Teaching Hard History, and it's about how the education around enslaved people and slavery in the United States is failing pretty badly in the United States right now, in the fact that 8% of high school students were able to identify that slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. So when we think about that, that's the history that our students are hearing and being left with, that active healing is not really happening. So using that education as an act of resistance in a way to really create healing in our country. So how do we bring Black Lives Matter into your classroom? First, you want to find comfort in discomfort. It's messy sometimes to wade into waters of curriculum that we're not necessarily comfortable with, and so we need to be able to find the comfort in that. We need to be able to be vulnerable. Conversations that have to do with race are not easy ones, but again, opening yourself up to being vulnerable and really having open, honest conversation will be huge. Also, address strong emotions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to address strong emotions and have a plan in the next few slides, but I just kind of wanted to lay a lay of the land of what that would look like. We have a guide here at Teaching Tolerance called Let's Talk, and it's a discussion guide for how you talk about race, racism, and other difficult conversations in your classroom. So it doesn't always have to be around race. It could be any sort of difficult conversation that you're trying to have and start in your classroom. So the kind of first part is like finding that comfort and discomfort. So letting go of the perfection and really realizing that the more that you have these difficult conversations in your classroom or with your colleagues or whoever it might be, the easier it will be to manage. The first time might not be so easy, but as time goes on, you become more comfortable in the content, more comfortable with the how it flows, and it's going to be easier to manage. A big part of this is establishing class norms or a contract, something that would say, we're okay with saying this, we agree to this, and having those really set, established classroom environment and classroom atmosphere pieces that are really going to lend itself to having a harmonious classroom that is ready for this type of work. We want to find comfort and discomfort, so this is really about looking at 3 pieces before you start. Anytime that you want to have a difficult conversation with your students or you want to embark a new territory that might, you might be a little tepid before you step in, is it thinking about, or timid, tepid is not the right word, timid before you step in, think about your vulnerabilities. So in thinking about race, what are my vulnerabilities? And we have some examples there for you. So it could be my children are multiracial. Can I be objective? I don't know enough about what's the vulnerability that I have? But then also thinking about what are the strengths that you bring to the table. If you have a great rapport with your students, that's a huge strength that you bring to the table. If you use community resources, also another huge strength. So really breaking this down to say, how am I vulnerable, what are my strengths, and then what are my needs in order to, make this plan of action work. I need to learn more information about Black Lives Matter. It could be that you want to do some research into the differences between Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. Maybe you want to talk about the different points that Black Lives Matter is calling for, and you want to really dig into those. So whatever it might be, it's important that you have kind of the understanding of where you stand on those 3 areas. Next, you want to think about how you are going to address strong emotions in your classroom. These emotions are going to come up, especially when you're talking about something that's such a hot topic as Black Lives Matter. So if something is coming up, and especially if you have a lot of discrepancy in the classroom about what people believe about Black Lives Matter, things are going to come up. Pain, blame, guilt, shame, confusion, etc. Something I always point to is that blame. By having those scaffolds placed in your classroom, like I was speaking of before, kind of those classroom norms, if you use, something as simple as I statements. I speak for myself, not for everyone else, or not for other people. So we don't use they, we don't use we don't use those people, we say I. We speak for ourselves, and that really tends to kind of harness that blame that can get thrown around in conversations like this. Because, that part more next to blame where it says, racism is like smog. We're all really breathing in, the racism and the smog, and were harmed by it. And while our students didn't create that system, they can help to contribute to the end of racism. So civil rights done right is a tool that we have, and it's called a tool for teaching the movement. And it was originally intended as a way to teach the civil rights movement and really get beyond the heroes and holidays mentality. How do we, teach civil rights without reducing it to, I have a dream, Rosa Parks didn't get off the bus, and then, everybody was equal? Because that is, not only completely false, but also misses a huge part of the story, and also fails to make connections for our students about the past and the future. So thinking civil rights done right is something that I encourage teachers to use for multiple movements. This could be for Viva la Causa when we're talking about Cesar Chavez and the labor unions. This can be for Black Lives Matter. This can be for LGBT rights and the fight for marriage equality. Whatever it might be, this is kind of a lens for how you look at a movement. So here are the 5 essential practices when you want to teach a movement. First of all, you want to educate for empowerment. We're educating our students to be empowered about their own learning and about their own history. You need to know how to talk about race, which is something, of course, that I just talked about in our Let's Talk guide, and just, expressing those vulnerabilities and those strengths and having a plan. Number 3 is that you want to capture the unseen. So what is the story that's not being told in the civil rights movement? Are we talking about Bayard Rustin and LGBT members of the civil rights movement, or are they constantly kind of pushed to the side? Tell a complicated story. So this goes, how do we push beyond just the surface of what was happening to really look at, the disparities and the discrepancies and kind of all the underlying causes and layers of what was happening inside that movement. And number 5 is connect to the present. So how does the civil rights movement, or how does Black Lives Matter, how is it connecting to the present? Well, it's not a new movement at this point. It's been around for many years. So how is it connecting to what's happening now? And how does it connect also to the past about what has happened, just a long continuation of the civil rights movement that has been happening for many, many years in this country. So to expand on those just a little bit, when we're educating for empowerment, we really want to talk about an intersectional, really culturally responsive approach, that it wasn't, the civil rights movement wasn't just about Black people, and the Black Lives movement isn't just about Black people. There's way more happening there. Emphasize the importance of young people. Again, so empowered and so beautiful to see all the different students who are, walking out and marching across our country today, that, no social movement has really gained any traction without the help of young people. So really empower your students to talk about they can have a voice, and what they do matters in terms of action, in terms of laws, and in terms of change. How do we provide experiential learning opportunities and introduce students to role models that they can really look up to that they may have not heard of before? Number 2, know how to talk about race. This is kind of a little bit what I was speaking of earlier, but we want to avoid colorblindness. We want to speak from our own experiences. You want to start with yourself and create kind of that space for dialogue. So for capturing the unseen, broader civil rights movements across the country and in daily lives. Like I talked about, there are civil rights movements happening all over the world and all over our country right now. We want to get them out of sidebars and out of kind of, oh, this is happening, and really into the center of our discussion. We're talking about Black Lives Matter, oh, this is how it's seen in here, and this is how it's seen here. Know what's really happening. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. Use original sources and personal narratives to get at multiple perspectives and examine, the historical events in the context of the past and the present. We want to tell a complicated story. I'm going to talk a little bit to that last point where we go beyond the textbook. Black Lives Matter is not in our textbook, and if it is in your textbook, I'd love to hear from you because I'd love to see how it's being approached. But going beyond the textbook and really looking at what are the larger, contexts, but also what are the larger, how does this connect to other things that are happening in our country? How does this connect to laws? How does this connect to redlining at school districts? How does it connect to our judicial system, the school-to-prison pipeline, our prison industrial complex? There's so many ways that Black Lives Matter can connect to all sorts of different things that are happening in our country right now. And then I think, you know, when we were originally writing this and we were thinking about how do we connect to the present, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights Movement do not stand alone. They are an ongoing struggle that has been happening for hundreds of years in this country. And so we really want to address that the goals of civil rights movement are still unmet today, which is why the Black Lives Matter is a continuation of the Black Panther movement, the civil rights movement, and really pay attention to those local issues and struggles that are happening in your community, because every community has a story to tell, and many of them have a very sad story to tell about what is happening with Black lives in their schools and their discipline practices, and also in their courts and prisons and in their community. So a few last things for you to think about as you're planning and making lesson plans. Bringing Black Lives Matter into the classroom, think about the leaders. Who are they? You know, the women, it's all women who started Black Lives Matter, and they're queer women. So thinking about the intersectionality of who they are, and they're not just, you know, quote, just Black women. They have multiple identities to them, and there's leaders across the nation who are leading Black Lives Matter movements. Thinking about their groups, what is different between Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. Think about events that have happened, you know, how are they perceived in terms of the national, you know, under the national eye, how is Black Lives Matter perceived? What is the historical context? How is it going to be remembered? And also, as I spoke to, how is it a continuation of what has already been happening in our country? Opposition, this is a big one, and students really get involved in this when you think about what is the opposition to Black Lives Matter. And this could be the media and how it's being portrayed. This could be white supremacy. This could be the alt-right. This could be All Lives Matter or the Blue Lives Matter movement, and thinking about what is the pushback that is directly coming from people making the statement, Black Lives Matter. What are the tactics of Black Lives Matter? Nonviolence, peaceful protest, organizing, grassroots organizing, and thinking about how that has come to fruition. And then lastly, connections. How are we making connections to what else is happening in this country, and also what has happened in this country. So a few ideas of what this could look like at different grade level spans. I want to tell you that these are all things that I've seen in classrooms and all things that I've seen happen just so organically, and also very, both organically and also in a very planned, scripted fashion. So they've happened from both ways, but have nonetheless been so incredible and so powerful for students. So in that pre-K2, I know an amazing second grade teacher who does a dynamic timeline of events for Black Lives Matter, and she puts pictures up and she talks about what that looks like. Vocabulary, you know, very young students are able to talk about concepts of justice and fairness and equity. For that 3-5 intermediate grade, you can do current events, you can study expository text, research on prominent figures within the Black Lives Matter movement, and how making the connections between U.S. and state history. For 6-8, I've seen some incredible PSAs, public service announcements about what Black Lives Matter is and what it isn't, videos, responsive, you know, tweeting out different things, and kind of practicing kind of some safe social media outlets and lessons and poetry. And then finally, at the high school level, thinking about analyzing the role of media in Black activism and how it's portrayed and how it's seen. You know, kind of that collective action and how it's seen in different movements and how it's seen in Black activism. Exploring the history of racism and collective, like I spoke to, collective action throughout history. Those are a couple, you know, just a couple different examples of how this can look at different grade level spans. So I want to give you just a few examples as I finish up about what Black Lives Matter looked like. One of our advisory board members teaches in Rochester, New York, and his school community came together and said that they wanted to have a Black Lives Matter declaration made by their school board, and they also wanted to have a Black Lives Matter kind of week and day that was going to celebrate Black Lives Matter. And really, in their own words, the objectives were to grapple with the past, present, and future status of Black lives and really affirm that Black lives matter in all of our lives. And so these are real pictures from Rochester and the work that they were doing there, which was just incredibly empowering and so inspirational. So kind of some of the steps that they took were that they formed a committee, and they talked to other teachers, and they talked to parents, and, you know, members of the school community, and we got together and they said, okay, let's make a committee that involves kind of everybody from all different walks of what's happening, not just teachers, not just admin, and let's do our research. Who else has done this? What are other districts doing? Have other school boards made some sort of, declaration or proclamation about Black Lives Matter? And then they got together a bunch of instructional resources. They dug around through teaching tolerances stuff, but also teaching for change, and tons of amazing websites that are have instructional resources for how to teach Black Lives Matter in your classroom. But then they also did professional development. They watched webinars, they gathered videos, they learned kind of the background of Black Lives Matter. So they were themselves really educated before they implemented those instructional resources in front of their students. Communication, they talked with the parents. They said, this is what we're going to do. They talked with the school board. It was just a widespread, very open conversation that they had, and it was voluntary. So it was not mandated, but it was something that everybody was working on and everybody was doing together. And so people were able, to opt out, but for the most part, most people were involved. And I'm just going to leave you with this last image because I think it's such a beautiful testimony to what can happen when we embrace Black Lives Matter in our classrooms and we integrate it into our curriculum and kind of bring the school board on board and all members of the school community, that really beautiful things can happen and our students can learn so much and also be so empowered. So that's it for me.
Lauryn, thank you very much. I'm always impressed by how thoughtful and rich and well considered the ideas Teaching Tolerance presents are, and I want to thank you personally for bringing them to us in this wonderfully illustrated and explained way. So I appreciate all your suggestions and thoughtfulness about where this goes in the classroom at different grade levels. That was really marvelous. And now I want to open it up to everyone to post your questions in the chat box, post your own experiences, or raise your hand using the little hand icon in the participant box. I can call on you and activate your microphone, and you can speak directly to John and Lauryn. I think that there are some questions that have begun already, and I want to backtrack to Susan's question. This would be for John, and it was about David Walker's appeal, where she said, it's interesting the title makes colored citizens the first and primary audience while leaving space for interracial cooperation. Do you see that as another parallel between the movements you discussed?
Yes, I do. That's a very good question. It's a very very shrewd observation as well. I mean, the focus is on colored citizens, but he's explicitly leaving room for the activism of whites. And as David Walker knew, he was one of the early abolitionists. And if I didn't say it, I should have, and I'll emphasize it now, that the abolition movement was the first civil rights movement. It was seen as such. It was the first human rights movement, and both the black and the white abolitionist press, they emphasized as much. So there's a real direct line between the civil rights of David Walker and the civil rights of Stokely and of Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and the civil rights of Black Lives Matters and the millions of people who are involved in the radical organizers, Alicia Garcia, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi.
Thanks, John. I want to ask you a question about the role of youth. Because, Lauryn, I think you mentioned that these movements really haven't succeeded without youth involvement, that young people have been such a central part of former movements and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I wonder if you could talk a little more, maybe both of you, about youth and how people even as young as grade school have connected with these movements and made their voices heard? Do you see, obviously the picture that we are looking at right now is affirming the value of Black Lives Matter, but how do you see young people sort of advancing the cause of Black Lives Matter and of former movements?
So I can speak a little bit about the history. It's a great question, and Lauren, I thought your focus on you address the degree to which young people are continuing the movement, and that was also true in the abolition movement and in the civil rights movement. So the best example I could use, I wish I had I can send Deb the image and she can circulate it, but the abolition movement, they had an alphabet in which they taught young boys and girls their ABCs, and the alphabet was an abolition alphabet. So A is for abolition, and they describe what abolition means, and so it connects A with abolition. And it goes on down the list so that by the time you learn your alphabet, you are fully aware and of the abolition movement and the way in which slavery and racism tries to dehumanize other people. And it's a brilliant way of educating, informing, enlightening young people. And they were very, very focused on that. Jim McPherson, in one of his early books, describes the longevity and the afterlife of the abolition movement in part because of the way in which young people were made fully aware of its significance, and they were encouraged to participate as young people. And the same was true of the civil rights movement, Black Power and Black Panthers.
Thanks, John.
Sure, and I'll speak a little bit to kind of the history of that in terms of more specifically the civil rights movement, and thinking about, we have a video that's called the Children's March, and it's a DVD that also comes with a teacher's guide with it, and it talks specifically about how the Children's March that happened in Birmingham, that happened during the civil rights movement in terms of voting rights, was really a huge launching pad for the civil rights movement in terms of making the leaders of SNCC and other organizations really come to the head and say, okay, we're really going to do this. Now we've got kids that are in jail, and they're getting out of jail and coming right back to march, and really flooding the judicial system in terms of what are you going to do? You're going to perpetually incarcerate 7-year-old students, and so. That was really a huge one that I can point to, where students are able to see that connection between the two. But I think in terms of exposing them to what's happening today and showing them those pictures of what's happening today and how students can really rally behind something, because it's so powerful and it's so huge and it does have action. So I think if I were in the classroom and I was still teaching about teaching this subject and talking about Black Lives Matter, I would, by simply showing them pictures of who is out in the streets, there's a majority of the demographic that's out in the streets and protesting is young people.
Thanks, Lauren. We have a comment from Lindy about the connections between all these movements, and she notes that some people are uncomfortable saying Black Lives Matter but would never consider themselves anti-abolition or anti-civil rights. So I want to pick up on that idea right now, that for some people it's easier to deal with movements in retrospect than to embrace radicalism in the present. And I think that students probably also fall on that spectrum of comfort with being kind of on the front lines of something like this, or being more behind the scenes and sympathetic, or possibly even not sympathetic, really not ready and really needing to go through a longer process of becoming comfortable with this topic and these causes. And so I'm interested in thoughts from both of you about kind of social protest and how different people engage with it, and sort of how do you drive it forward in ways that are comfortable for a wide spectrum of people. Can you talk about some of the ways that people on a very personal level and style are able to participate, but not always marching in the street kind of activism?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things that I would say to that. I would say first that, you know, we need to be able to have enough conversations and enough education about what's happening with Black lives and brown lives, quite frankly, in our country, so that saying out loud Black Lives Matter is not radical. Mm-hmm. I think that's where I would start with. That if we are really honest with ourselves and we've had to, you know, kind of know the history of what's happened in this country and know what's happening in our prisons and our schools, then saying out loud Black Lives Matter should not be a radical act. It should be a statement of fact. So I want to start there, and then I want to say that absolutely everyone's not going to be protesting in a picket line or on the highway or willing to walk out of class. And so what we talk to students and teachers a lot about is how you can be an ally to a movement and how you can be in the center of the movement. And that has a lot to do with, you know, kind of a lot of identity and cultural awareness that I'm not going to dig into, but I think that it is important to realize that if you are a part of that group that's being oppressed, so if you are a Black person, it is, you know, your place to be within the Black Lives Matter movement. But if you are not, then you are an ally, and that means that you are supporting that cause from the outside and saying, this is not about me, this is about you, but how can I help? And I think about the picture when the Muslim ban happened, and we had there was this beautiful picture of a group of people who were Jewish and of all different religions who were standing and sitting in front of people who are Muslim. And that's what it means to be an ally. It means this is not about me, but I'm here to protect your right to protest and your right to be in front of this. And so I think a little bit of that can come up with students when you say, you know, protesting doesn't always look like being in the front lines. It can look like this. You can write a letter. You can you can create a PSA. You can help somebody else and kind of show them all those different options.
That's great. And Lauryn, in the beginning of her talk, she emphasized the degree to which, you know, so many movements in the present are seen as radical, but then in retrospect, where people have distance, they can look back and say, okay, these were really important and powerful movements. So the abolition movement at the time, you know, in 1830s to 1850s, only 1 or 2% of the population were self-described abolitionists. It began as an ex-slave movement, slaves who escaped to freedom, and then whites became involved in it. It was a true integrated, as I said, civil rights, human rights movement. But they were despised. I mean, in the 1830s, there were mob attacks against abolitionists because they were seen as so radical and revolutionary, both Black and white abolitionists. And the same was true in the civil rights movement. There were a lot of, you know, whites who called themselves, you know, progressives or liberals, hated Black Power. They hated Black Panthers. They hated, in a sense, the idea of true equality. But then in retrospect, we look back and we celebrate it. And in part, the celebration is that this understanding and this vision of progress where Americans can pat themselves on the back and say, well, yeah, things were bad in Jim Crow segregation, but the civil rights movement helped, you know, we progressed, and ignoring the fact that many people, a huge number of people at the time opposed it. And so one of the ways that I think that is really helpful is understanding the relationship between past and present. And I would emphasize that, and one of the reasons I showed or connected the abolition movement with the civil rights movement, with Black Lives Matter movement, they're all examples of civil rights and human rights movements. They're all intimately connected. They're all, you know, in the sense, kindred spirit movements. And so if you're going to condemn one, you need to condemn the other in that sense. And that makes it easier to look. If you start with a historical movement that people can say, well, that was a positive success, and then connect it to a movement in the present and say this movement is just like that movement was, or very similar, that raises consciousness in a sense about maybe I should reconsider the degree to which I'm listening to certain people who are saying, oh, Black Lives Matter is a threatening movement in some ways. Any protest movement is a threatening movement because you're seeking to affect change, and in this case, radical change in the United States because of the degree to which racism simply marinates American society and has, to a degree, to a large degree, from the very beginning. So, in a sense, history can become, and has always been, an activist's muse. That's the easiest way to describe it. Black Lives Matter activists are deeply inspired by Black Power, by Black Panthers, by the abolition movements, if we as teachers and as students and as just citizens recognize that, I think that can help as well. And the final thing I'll say is in terms of how do you participate. I think Lauryn is absolutely right. You participate in the ways that you feel most comfortable doing. I mean, not everyone is going to feel comfortable marching in the streets, but you might feel comfortable doing things that reflect or relate what you enjoy doing. So, I mean, to go back to the 1968 Olympic sign, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, they were first and foremost athletes. That's who they were. But simply because they were athletes didn't mean that they could not participate in this movement. So, they donned black gloves. They expressed to the world their affiliation, their activist support of Black Power and Black Panther, essentially equal rights, in the same way that athletes today take the knee. And they're first and foremost athletes, but their taking the knee is their way of marching in the street, their way of expressing themselves, their way of showing their support, their way of expressing their alliance. And it's not marching in the street, and it's not the mainstream, but each person knows what's comfortable for him or her, and there are ways in which you can show your support based on your own comfort zone.
John and Lauryn, after those two really brilliant answers, it's hard to know where to go, and in fact we're out of time to develop things more, but I want to say that the fact we're having this conversation, the fact that there is this movement called Black Lives Matter, suggests the degree to which we still have a long way to go in this country. And I think our prior webinars on the social legacies of slavery and the challenges within our legal system and how it's been used to harm Black and brown people in the U.S. also echoed that point. So as teachers, we are on the front lines of change, I think. The minds of children are what will shape the minds of adult activism, and we don't have to wait. That's clear as well. So thanks for bringing up so many points for us to think about and giving us food for our own work going forward. You've been amazing speakers and presenters for us. So we need to end there, but I want to encourage everyone to keep in touch with Primary Source through our website, through our Teacher Digest and our newsletter, through our social media, and also to check out the wonderful resources at Teaching Tolerance. I think they really go a long way to helping us to address these causes. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you, Lauryn. Thank you, John. You've been wonderful. And that's all for today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.